fiance learned about my hysterectomy from my mom's jokes at lunch, and now he doubts what else I'm hiding. I'm a woman in my late 20s, and my fiance, Carlos, is in his early 30s. We're still fighting about something that happened 2 weeks ago, and I can't shake how intense the whole thing became. When I was just 21, I had a partial hysterectomy because of adenomyosis. The pain was unbearable, and getting the surgery approved was an ordeal. My doctor fought for 2 years to get everyone on board. I never really grieved the loss of my uterus. Honestly, I felt relief. I'd always been child-free. I didn't care for kids even as a kid. Carlos came into my life 3 years ago. On our first date, I told him point blank that I was child-free and completely sterile. He told me he was child-free too, so we moved ahead with our relationship, enjoying the endless possibilities that freedom gave us. We got engaged in September, celebrating with slow, happy wedding planning. I honestly never told him about the hysterectomy itself, not because I was hiding anything, but because I thought I'd already covered the important part. I couldn't get pregnant, ever. My mom didn't know about the engagement at first because she was out of the country caring for her elderly sister. I wanted to tell her in person, so when she finally returned 3 weeks ago, I waited until she was rested and then invited her to lunch with us. Carlos is a prankster, never in a cruel way, but he likes to make people laugh. That day, as we ate, and just before I could show my mom the ring, Carlos grabbed her hand and blurted out, "I'm sorry, Mrs. my mom's name, I impregnated your daughter." My mom exploded with laughter, turned to me, and said, "Either you're about to get rich or you grew a new uterus." I laughed too and shot back that the universe better not have given me a new uterus because it would have to fight off half the doctors in the country, and their grandmas, first. Carlos suddenly stared at me, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. My mom, still giggling, said, "The hysterectomy, of course." Carlos's face dropped. He said he'd never heard about it. My mom laughed again, teasing, "How does he not know?" I shrugged and admitted I just never thought to mention it because, to me, it didn't matter anymore. There was a brief, awkward silence, but then I showed my mom the ring, and we all celebrated together. After she left, Carlos confronted me. He asked why I'd never told him about the surgery. I told him I thought I'd told him what mattered. I was sterile. But to him, it was the principle. He said if I could keep something so big from him for years, what else could I be hiding? That accusation felt unfair. I never meant to hide anything. I honestly shared what was relevant to our relationship, and after so many years, the medical details didn't even occur to me. It wasn't a secret, it was just buried so deep after all that trauma and embarrassment that I never thought it needed to come up again. For a long time, after that surgery, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Half the medical community seemed to have seen or examined me, and the whole ordeal was humiliating. I just wanted to forget it, push the whole experience away. When I met Carlos, I was in no mood to dump all that trauma onto someone I'd just met, especially when it was rooted in such a sensitive, private place. I'm not a talkative person, especially back then. I probably barely spoke 50 words that entire first date. I've opened up more now, at least with Carlos, but I still tend to keep things that feel deeply personal, unless they're actually relevant. Looking back, for anyone wondering why I didn't tell him in case of a medical emergency, I realize now that's a fair point, and something I hadn't really considered. Carlos and I have been reading through a lot of advice and opinions together, and we both agree there are things here that may be best to discuss with a professional. We're planning to have a session with a couples counselor soon to talk through all of this, and I hope it helps us move past this misunderstanding. Update 1. We had our session yesterday, and I finally feel ready to reflect on what happened and clarify a few things. Carlos and I decided it was best for me to tell this from my own perspective. Anytime we tried to share it as a couple, it just got too confusing. First, let me get something straight for those who keep bringing it up. Just because I still have my ovaries does not mean we can have kids. That isn't how being child-free works. We simply do not want children, period. People have also been asking about scars. Honestly, I'm not sure what to tell anyone about that. It's a very personal thing for me, but I will say the doctors made an incision in my belly button, and that's all I want to share about it. Carlos and I agreed not to discuss any of this further until we reached our therapist's office, and that ended up being exactly what we needed. The first thing Carlos did was look at me and apologize. He really opened up about why he'd been so upset. It wasn't so much anger about me not telling him, he admitted, but more that it felt like for a long time, he had to drag information out of me. When I finally did start sharing things more openly, he got excited, thinking we were completely on the same wavelength with everything. So, when he found out about the surgery, it made him feel insecure and left out, as if it was always me and my mom against the world, and then him tagging along. He also told me he felt embarrassed and a bit foolish for just assuming he knew what sterile meant and running with that instead of asking. At the heart of it, it was insecurity, and he apologized again for the way he handled his feelings and for not communicating with me right away. He also brought up that truly cringeworthy pregnancy joke. He explained he'd been anxious, because he genuinely admires my mom but felt uncertain about her feelings towards him. In the middle of his nerves, he tried to lighten the tension with a joke, which, of course, landed terribly. He genuinely meant no harm and apologized for that, too. On my end, I apologized for not sharing something so significant with him, and for the ways I can sometimes come across as cold or distant. I told him that I love him deeply and I want to spend the rest of my life together. He's my person. I promise to always tell him things about myself now, even if they don't seem exciting or important, because he wants to know me fully. After the session, we went home and spent the whole evening sharing every last ridiculous thing about ourselves, just so there'd be no more secrets left. Most of them I already knew. Carlos is what I'd call an oversharer, but, to my surprise, I discovered he once broke his little toe at age 7, and he was equally astonished by the fact that I still have all 4 of my wisdom teeth. We decided to put wedding planning on hold until the holidays are over. There's no need to rush, right now, we just want to be with each other and soak it all in. We'll start fresh in January. I called my mom and invited her over for dinner on Sunday, so we can redo the engagement announcement and make sure it feels special for all 3 of us, this time with nothing left unsaid. Looking back, I realize that privacy is important in every relationship, but so is feeling close. It was never my intent to hide anything from Carlos, but if sharing more makes him feel loved, I don't mind at all. I want us to know everything about one another, even the boring parts. We'll continue going to couples counseling for as long as we need. For now, though, I feel hopeful and more connected with Carlos than ever before. Happy holidays to everyone. Update 2. As someone who has actually gone through a vaginally assisted laparoscopic hysterectomy, it's finally my time to shine with some first-hand experience. A partial hysterectomy meant they left my cervix intact. In contrast, with a complete hysterectomy, they would have taken the cervix out too and sewn the whole thing up. If we're talking about the fallopian tubes, that's called a salpingectomy, while removing the ovaries is an oophorectomy. These are all entirely different surgeries. Because my case wasn't cancer-related, laparoscopic surgery was the preferred choice. Makes sense, right? I can tell you, the thought of them slicing a big line through all my muscles and flesh did not appeal to me. In the end, my scars look like tiny blips, maybe a ½ inch at most each. If you saw my belly, you'd never think I had major surgery at all. Though, I've got to admit, they did mess up my belly button. I'm still a little sad about that. The vaginal part of it is pretty much exactly what you're imagining. One less incision to make sense, well, the hole's already there, right? Most of the bigger scars are actually on the inside, around the cervix area, but it's not like folks are routinely peeking inside to check in on the interior decor. Update 3. 2 days later, I got an email from the hospital where I had my surgery. It was from their privacy office, bland subject line and all caps notice. Apparently a training video, an internal lecture on minimally invasive gynecologic surgery, briefly showed a screen with my full name and medical record number during a slide transition. It shouldn't have made it into any recording, but it did, and it got uploaded to a library that was supposed to be behind a firewall. It wasn't. They discovered it last week and pulled it down the same day, but not before it had been accessed a handful of times. I don't know how to explain the feeling except that it was like someone opened a door I'd spent years bricking over. My hands went cold. Carlos went very, very calm in the way he does when he's about to take care of something. He asked if I wanted him to handle the call, and I said I wanted to hear it myself. So we called. They offered the standard apology, though we take your privacy seriously, the free credit monitoring. I surprised myself by asking for a meeting. I didn't want gift cards or a templated letter. I wanted to look a human being in the face and ask if any of this made sense to them. To their credit, they set it up. The surgeon who led my case came, along with someone from risk management and the privacy officer. The surgeon remembered me. Not my name, but my case. He was older than I remembered, softer at the edges, and he looked horrified when he realized what had happened. He said my case had been used in that lecture because it was a textbook presentation of adenomyosis responding well to a partially sparing approach. He said the video was supposed to be scrubbed of anything identifying and that showing my chart, even for a second, was inexcusable. Then he looked right at me and said he was sorry for putting even a sliver of that experience back on my shoulders. No qualifiers. I told them about the years before the surgery, about why I didn't talk about it and why finding out this way felt like being walked in on. I told them I wasn't out for blood, I just wanted them to understand what a 9 seconds on a screen does to a person. The privacy officer took notes, and then risk management started to talk about resolution, which is a very tidy word. We agreed they would document the breach in my record, remove my name from any associated media, and implement an additional review step for gynecologic recordings. They offered a settlement. I'm not going to share the amount because that's not the point, but it was enough that it felt like they knew this wasn't small. The strangest grace note came from pathology. The surgeon asked, gently, if I had ever seen the histology from my surgery. I hadn't. He asked if I wanted to. I said I wasn't sure, and then I surprised myself again and said yes. He pulled up a slide image. It looked nothing like a body part. It looked like a storm in watercolor, dark islands of endometrial glands marooned in muscle, everything swirled and stubborn and exactly as painful as it had been. He pointed out the borders and the invasion and his voice went quiet, like we were in a museum. Carlos squeezed my hand and whispered that my insides were gorgeous and terrifying, which is, frankly, correct. We walked out into winter light and got soup from a place that gives you a hunk of bread the size of a couch cushion. Carlos did not crack a single joke. He asked me if I wanted to use the settlement for anything specific, and I told him I wanted to split it, part to start a tiny fund with our names on it through the hospital foundation, earmarked for patients who need help traveling for gynecologic care, part to pay for a boring, practical thing we've been putting off. We came home with a fireproof lockbox and filled it that night, passports, my advance directive, his, the ICE card our therapist suggested we write, a one-page summary of my surgery and allergies, the number for our primary care, the counselor's card. It felt morbid for 5 minutes and then it felt like breathing room. My mom came over the next day and made too much tea. I told her what happened. She went very still and then got that expression she gets when she's writing a letter in her head. I told her not to scorch earth on my behalf. She said she would settle for a sternly worded sentence directed at the universe. Then she asked to see the histology picture, and when she did, she whispered, "No wonder," like she'd been holding that word in her throat for years. Wedding-wise, we're still paused until January. Yesterday, out of nowhere, Carlos handed me a little jewelry box. Inside was a thin silver bracelet engraved on the inside with my initials and an emergency contact number. No cutesy uterus charms. No bits. Just something solid. He said, "For once in my life I have edited a joke before it happens, and I think that might be the moment I actually fell in love with him twice." It's a strange thing to feel more known and more private at the same time. I said yes to seeing a picture of the problem that stole a whole era of my life, and then I put a lock on the box that holds the rest of my life's paperwork. Both felt like choices I made, not reactions. That's new for me. Update 4. The redo dinner was not dramatic. My mom showed up with an almond cake from the little Portuguese bakery that still writes with buttercream like it's the 80s. She hugged Carlos first, because she's stubborn, and then me, because she's mine. We did the ring the way we meant to do it the first time. Carlos made a short, awkward toast about being grateful to be trusted, which ended with him promising my mother, hand to heart, that he would never again joke about pregnancy in any kitchen she is standing in. She clinked his glass and said, "You are learning," which, from her, might as well be a benediction. It felt like untying a knot and putting the rope back on a hook. 2 days after that, we sat in a windowless room at the hospital foundation signing forms. The woman from donor relations had a cardigan with tiny gold bees on it and eyes like she had been holding other people's emergencies all morning. She asked what we wanted to call the fund. We didn't go kitschy. We just put our names on it and the words travel assistance for gynecologic care. She nodded like that was the right answer. She told us, without details, that a tank of gas or a night at a motel makes the difference between missed surgery and kept appointments more often than anyone wants to admit. She said, "This will get used," in the same tone nurses use when they say this will sting. On the way out, Carlos squeezed my shoulder and said, "Good all around," which is his shorthand for any situation where nobody gets a parade but something still got better. That night, he handed me his phone with a calendar open. He booked a consultation with a urologist. The title just said appointment, but the address gave it away. He was nervous, a kind of quiet I recognized from the bracelet day. He said he'd been thinking about it a lot. He said he wanted the thing we say we are to live on both our bodies, not just mine. He said he did not want us to rely on my surgery to hold the line on a decision we both made. He asked what I thought. I told him what our therapist told us to say when we're startled by a gesture that touches something old. I notice I'm having two feelings at once. Pride and tenderness were loudest. There was also a tiny, ancient panic, which I think was the part of me that is always braced for someone to hold my body up as a checklist of what's wrong. It passed. This was his choice, and frankly, it was one of the first times in my life that I got to be the one who says, "I'll drive you home." The urology office was exactly what you'd expect. A ficus that had been alive for so long it had a personality, a framed medical school diploma from the year I learned to ride a bike, a poster of the renal system that was anatomically correct and somehow still a little ridiculous. The doctor was brisk and kind in the way of people who have given the same speech 1,000 times and still mean it. He walked Carlos through everything, including a perfectly rendered diagram that looked like a chef's sketch of a complicated sausage. Carlos asked smart questions. He did not make a single pun. I didn't know I could love someone for the absence of a joke until then. On the day itself, he wore his favorite stupidly soft sweatpants and kissed me twice before he went back. 20 minutes later it was done. He walked out like a proud cowboy who had just remembered horses exist and did not want to alarm them. I tucked him into our couch with 2 gel packs and the kind of documentary you only pick when you need the world to narrate itself in straight lines, penguins cutting neat paths through snow. When the gel packs warmed, I switched to a bag of frozen mango because we were out of peas. He held it like a precious tropical artifact and announced, very solemnly, that these were the best mangoes he had ever met. The only time he cracked was when the aftercare instructions said no heavy lifting and he glared at the vacuum like it had personally offended him. I didn't expect how it would feel to be the one fetching water and keeping time. There's a version of care I know too well, the one where you're bracing for pain and bracing against people and bracing against your own mind. This wasn't that. This was a small thing that hurt and then hurt less. The body was edited, and the world did not wobble. When he fell asleep with the mango pack sliding off his waistband, I tucked a towel in place and stood there longer than I needed to. It felt like a muscle unclenching that I didn't know I still had. We updated our ICE cards to include the new information. I wrote vasectomy, yes in the margins, and then laughed at myself because it looked like a weird aside in a grocery list. We put the cards back in the bracelet box. My mom dropped by with soup and did not say a word about Carlos's hobble walk down the hall except to ask if he needed a cushion. He told her he was taking a brief sabbatical from heroism. She said good. The only truly surreal moment came when an email arrived from the hospital's privacy office with an attachment I wasn't expecting. It was a TIFF file and a line that said, "Per your request, you have full rights to this image." It was the histology slide. I opened it on the big screen and sat down on the floor like I had been politely knocked over. Carlos sat next to me. We stared at that storm, the little whirlpools, the dark shorelines, the places where everything pushed into everything else until there was no arguing with it anymore. It was data and also, weirdly, a portrait. We printed it on thick paper that caught the ink like it belonged there. We didn't hang it in the living room, we hung it in the hallway across from the closet with the lockbox, a place only people who live here bother to walk down and stare at. My mom saw it the next day when she came to drop off more soup. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and just looked. Then she nodded and said, "There you are." She was right. There I was. 2 mornings after that, the foundation woman with the bee cardigan left me a voicemail. A patient had used the fund for an overnight stay to make it to an early morning pre-op. She didn't tell me who, because that's not how any of this works, but she said how relieved the social worker had been to have something to offer besides an apology. Good all around, I told Carlos. He said, "Honey, that's my line," and kissed my cheek like he was borrowing it. So now there is a bracelet on my wrist with an inside secret engraving, a little rectangle of paper in a lockbox with all our numbers on it, a photo of my insides being a storm, and my fiancé on the couch with a bag of fruit pressed to his dignity, watching birds hurl themselves off cliffs and fly anyway. I don't mean it as a metaphor. Or I do. It's probably both. Either way, we are exactly where we said we wanted to be, child-free by choice, and that choice sitting quietly in both our bodies, not needing to shout to be real. We'll start the wedding again in January, like we promised ourselves. I think we're going to be very, very good at vows. Update 5. January started with a number on a little red ticket and the kind of chairs that make even confident people sit like they're borrowing the floor. The county clerk's office smelled like paper and winter. There was a poster about affidavit of parentage drooping behind a fern that had given up making choices. We filled out the form for a marriage license, and right between boxes for middle names and previous marriages was a line that asked how many children lived in our household. Carlos looked at me like the universe had tried a tiny callback joke. I put a neat 0 and, because I am who I am and because we've been practicing telling the truth even when no one's asking for a speech, I wrote a none planned in the margin and then immediately drew a line through it because the clerk does not need my essay. The clerk called our number. She had a small gold pin shaped like a hummingbird on her sweater and a ring that looked like it could knock sense into a table. She read our names, stamped our papers, and asked if we wanted a keepsake copy with a ribbon. We paid the extra $5. It was the cheapest part of it all and somehow the most official. The same day, on a bulletin board next to a flyer for a lost parrot named Buster who sings only in commercials, there was an open call for a community art show. Theme, inside/out. I took a picture of it and then tried very hard not to think about the file on my desktop that had felt like a private reliquary since it arrived. 2 nights later, I stopped trying so hard. We printed the histology slide again, larger this time, on paper that cost more than logic allows for a thing you will never write on. We took it to a frame shop where a man with perfect eyebrows held the matte board up to it and said, "This red likes being taken seriously." We titled it "There You Are." We used only my initials on the card because it felt like a clean line between choosing to share and volunteering my full name to a room of strangers. The opening smelled like free cheese and new paint. Everyone had a plastic cup and an opinion. I stood across the room and watched people try to decide if my insides were a nebula. A teenager with half her head shaved said, "I want this as a tattoo," in the reverent tone that forgives everything. A woman with a cane and a coat that looked expensive in the exact way warm does stopped, tilted her head, and said very softly, "No wonder," in the same voice my mother uses when the past fits in a word. No one asked me anything, which was a kindness I didn't know to be grateful for until I had it. Carlos kept his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into that open, gentle expression he gets when he's standing in a place that used to make me small and refusing to take up any air I might need. When we were ready to leave, he squeezed my elbow and said, "You hung a boundary in a storm and people clapped." He is not wrong. 8 weeks after the sweatpants and the penguins, we went back to the urologist's office for the check that tells you if a decision has caught up with biology. The sample room was aggressively beige. It was also impeccably clean, which I suppose is something you want in exactly that context. There was a plant that might have been plastic and a poster that tried very hard to be neutral about something that is not, inherently, neutral. Carlos took his phone in with headphones the way a person takes a book on a crowded bus, shield and companion. I sat in the waiting room and did a crossword in pen because you can choose your own level of drama. He emerged with ears a little pink and a receipt-looking paper folded in thirds, like he had just bought the world's strangest sandwich. The lab results arrived that afternoon in a portal that uses a font meant to be soothing. No motile sperm observed. There is a particular kind of relief that sounds like a door latch turning the way it was designed to. We walked to the Portuguese bakery. They were out of almond cake, so we got 2 custard tarts and split them standing at the little counter, our rings knocking lightly against the metal when we reached for napkins, sugar dust rising like something tiny and celebratory. We met with our therapist again that week and told her about the hummingbird pin in the gallery and the sentence in the lab report. She smiled the way people do when they are trying not to take any credit and failing. On the way home, we stopped by the foundation office to sign one last form because liability never sleeps. The woman with the bee cardigan wasn't there, but a man with a tie patterned with tiny planets told us that, in the first month, 3 different social workers had drawn from the fund. He didn't say anything about anyone at all, which is exactly the point. He said, "It's making mornings easier," and then he grimaced and said, "That sounded like a slogan," and we all laughed into our coats because sometimes relief is awkward. Wedding planning started in earnest anyway. We booked a date at the courthouse because the idea of our vows ricocheting around a ceiling built for trials and taxes appeals to my sense of proportion. We picked a small restaurant for afterward, the kind with tablecloths that are actually cloth and a waiter who says my pleasure without sounding like he's auditioning to be your cousin. At home, we wrote vows at the kitchen table. Carlos crossed out 3 jokes before he read me his draft and then added 1 back in, to promise he would edit before speaking, and it was perfect. I wrote a line about the storm on the wall and the bracelet on my wrist and the box in the closet and named them as choices, not reactions. I didn't cry. I do not need to learn a new trick this late in the month. A small thing, the hospital emailed to ask if I would come speak for 10 minutes to a room full of residents about privacy that is not just pixel level but human. I said yes and then immediately wanted to call my mother to ask what one wears to scold gently. I didn't scold. I told them about the 9 seconds and how it reopened a door I had bricked over, and then I told them about soup that tastes better after an apology and bracelets with numbers inside and the way a picture can be both a body and not at all. I told them the thing that has been sitting on my tongue since December. Sometimes the kindest part of care is not taking my choices away from me. They didn't clap. They just nodded in that full-bodied way that feels like agreement and a little homework. In the hallway, the surgeon who remembered my case said, "Thank you," and I said, "You're welcome," and there were no qualifiers in the air to trip over. We took the keepsake license with the ribbon and tucked it into the lockbox behind the ice cards. It made a satisfying sound as it slid against the stack. Later, when the house was quiet in that deep, post-snow way, we stood in the hallway and looked at the framed storm. It has begun to feel less like evidence and more like art, which might be the same thing said in different rooms. Carlos touched the edge of the frame with one finger like he was finding the corners of a map. "Good all around," he said, very softly this time, like the opposite of a toast. I think that's what vows are going to feel like telling the truth gently in a place that was designed to hear it. Update 6. We got married between a vending machine that only takes quarters and a sign that said absolutely no confetti. The courthouse was the exact shade of beige that makes time sit down, but the security guard had a sticker of a cartoon shark on his laptop and called us lovebirds in a tone that had survived 1,000 Tuesdays. He asked me to take off my bracelet for the metal detector. I slid it into the plastic tray and watched it go through the little X-ray cave like a swimmer holding their breath. When I put it back on, Carlos tapped the inside with his fingertip, just once, like he was checking a piano key. The clerk with the hummingbird pin was at a different window, pinning dates to calendars. Our number popped up. The woman at ours had nails that looked like tiny medals and a voice that had filed off panic for other people many times. She stamped the license, held it up like a small flag, and said, "You're going to want to keep this." We promised we would. The judge had eyebrows that could have carried a case by themselves and a gavel with a little dent in it shaped like history. We stood in front of a seal and a plant determined to touch the fluorescent light and said the words we'd written at the kitchen table. Carlos kept his promise and edited before he spoke. I kept mine and named the storm on our wall and the box in our closet as choices. Halfway through, an alarm coughed. Not the full howl, the kind that thinks about it first, 2 test beeps like a robot deciding. The judge glanced at the ceiling and said, "Maintenance," in a tone that told me this was not her first ceremony to share real estate with a systems check. "Shall we?" she asked, and we did, finished in the hallway, on the landing between floors where the paint has been bumped by 1,000 briefcases. A teenager in a hoodie sat 3 steps down, waiting to be told where to go next, and watched us with the soft blankness of someone seeing a new species of bird. The echo turned our vows into something else entirely, call and response with the building. It felt right. You never really know what you're promising until you hear yourself say it near an exit sign. My mother wore her good coat and a face that did not need to be brave. She produced, from nowhere, a thin blue ribbon and tucked it under my bracelet like a magician forcing a card. "For tradition," she said, and then made a show of reading the no confetti sign and settled on scattering exactly 3 wildflower seeds on the courthouse steps because she is nothing if not precise. The seeds looked ridiculous and sweet and exactly enough. After, we walked to the small restaurant. The waiter said my pleasure like he meant he's had worse afternoons. The tablecloth was actually cloth. We split a piece of almond cake even though it wasn't on the menu because the chef had scraps, which is a phrase I would like on a crest somewhere. Our rings made a tiny, persistent sound against the plates that felt like somebody else gently knocking to be let into the room where we were. Halfway through coffee, my phone buzzed with an email from the gallery, subject line inside/out. There you are had been voted a favorite. Someone wanted to buy it. The name they left was the Hospital Foundation, which did a small, dignified somersault in my gut. The message was careful: if I was willing, they hoped to hang it in a staff hallway outside the auditorium where people teach people how to care for other people. The conditions were whatever I said. I read it twice. Carlos looked at me with his face in neutral, the expression that says whatever I choose will be the right thing and he will fight anyone who says otherwise. I said yes and sent words that were less armor than rules. The card would say displayed with permission and my initials, nothing else. If they moved it, they would ask me first. It would live where the people who make choices walk by. The reply was immediate and grateful in that way that feels like relief you can fold and put in your pocket. Back at the courthouse, the judge caught us in the hallway to hand over the keepsake license with the ribbon, the one we paid the extra $5 for. She said, "You two did very well with a false alarm, which is, I think, a kind of benediction only certain rooms can offer." On the way out, a man on the steps was holding a gray parrot that whistled the first 5 notes of a jingle with comic timing. The owner had a flyer in his pocket that looked exactly like the one from the clerk's bulletin board. "Buster's back," he told whoever would listen. The bird bobbed and said, "Limited time only," in a voice that was more precise than any verdict. Winter had softened into that narrow band of afternoon when the air pretends it might forgive us. We took the train home, sat knee to knee, and did the crossword with a shared pen. The clue for vows was solemn promises. Too neat, we wrote oaths and kept going. At home, we opened the lockbox. The bracelet tapped the lid when I leaned over, a small sound like glass remembering it used to be sand. We slid the ribbon license in behind the ice cards, next to the document that says advance in hospital language. The box felt heavier even though it was just paper. Choice is weight and balance both. 2 days later, I stood in the hospital auditorium under a projector that worked on the first try. The slide on the screen was a picture of a picture. There you were in its frame, read taken seriously, a small plaque that said displayed with permission like a sentence that had done its homework. Staff walked past it with coffees and laptops and the distracted, determined faces of people on the clock. A resident paused, tilted her head, and then kept going. I wanted exactly that, to be seen and also to be part of the furniture of respect. The woman from the foundation with the bee cardigan met us in the lobby to say thank you without telling us anything she could not. She had traded bees for little planets on her scarf, and I am trying not to read omens into accessories. On the way out, the surgeon with the softer edges saw us and lifted a hand and let it be that simple. The gallery sent a small check the next week, which felt ridiculous and ceremonial to cash for something that used to live inside my body. We bought nothing symbolic with it. We paid the gas bill and got a frame for the keepsake license that matches the storm. Now the hallway looks like a thesis. Tonight, the house is the kind of quiet that comes after being officially witnessed. The no confetti sign was right, we didn't need it. The vows feel like they're still moving through the building we left, drafting behind us, catching up every time the heat turns on and the pipes clear their throat. Carlos is at the sink arguing with a sponge about a pan like he's negotiating a treaty. He turns, catches my eye, and taps his ring against the counter twice, the new sound of our kitchen. Good all around, he says, not as a slogan and not as a joke. Just as a thing that is true in the room where we're standing.